Sitopia. How can food save our cities? Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski, and this is the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, cities, architecture, and many more. I am so happy to present the newest conversation with Carolyn Steel, who is the leading thinker on food and cities and also a trained architect. But the main scope of our conversation will be one of her books. I'm so excited that the 99th episode of this podcast is together with Carolyn Steel, who is a truly inspiring leading thinker on food and cities. I need to admit that I fell in love with her book called Sitopia, and ever since I wanted to invite her to the podcast. It was so amazing that she agreed to talk to me, and in this special episode I will talk to Carolyn Steel about her book Sitopia and about our connection to the food and also how the food is influencing our lives. Carolyn, as I mentioned, is the author of two books. One of them is about how do we feed a city? It's a question that we rarely ask, but which lies at the core of our civilization. The book, which was published in 2008, is about the food journey, from the production from the field, through all the roads, to all the delivery services to our cities and then to our plates. Sitopia is the sequel to Hungry City, and it explores the idea first developed in the previous book that food shapes our lives, and the book asks what we can do with this knowledge in order to lead better ones. In essence, it is a practical food-based philosophy. Her concept of Sitopia, or food place, from the Greek sitos, food, plus topos, place, has gained broad recognition across a wide range of fields in design, ecology, academia, and arts. As I mentioned in our conversation, I was smiling for most of the time of our conversation because I was just very happy to be able to be influenced and inspired by Carolyn and her journey. I hope that you will enjoy listening to this conversation at least as much as I did while recording it. Welcome to the newest episode with Carolyn Steel, the author of Sitopia. I will just start by saying that I am very excited and pleased that you will be the part of the show because I love your book and I'm very happy that you found some time to share some thoughts about the book. So Carolyn, welcome to Urbcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I need to say that when I first heard about your book, it was published in English as well, of course, but it was the Polish version that I heard of. And it's, as we just discussed, it is published in a very attractive way. The cover is very beautiful. But when I first get to know about the book, I was thinking, book about food. Can it be interesting in the city context? When I started reading that, I didn't know what to expect. And it turned out into a huge positive surprise to me that I really fell in love how you told us the story about the food. So maybe we could start with that part. Since you are a trained architect, how did the idea of the deep dive into the food topic came about to be?
Yeah, through a very long and painful process, I think is the short answer to that. I mean, basically, I always wanted to be an architect from a very young age. Yeah. I would say from the age of maybe even 7 or 8 years old. I was kind of obsessed with buildings, and I don't even know where it came from, to be perfectly honest. And then I sort of went on to study architecture at Cambridge University in the UK. And I would say probably within about a year of starting to study, there was something in my head that was kind of going, well, this is kind of all great and everything, but it's not really, there's something else about architecture that I'm interested in that is not what I'm being taught. Yeah. It's not what we're talking about. And that was the really beginning, as I say, of a long and painful journey which became more extreme over time. And, I qualified And then I started practicing architecture, and I was then teaching as well. And I think increasingly it became clear to me that what I'm really interested in is not buildings per se for themselves, but in a way, our relationship with them. So it's something about the relationship between the human and the built form. And then I really will spare you the details because I was sort of searching, and I started to read a lot outside architecture, so much more politics, sociology, things that were not strictly architecture. And I was a scholar in Rome, and then when I was teaching, I started to set projects for my students that were sort of to do really with exploring what it means to inhabit a building, I guess, and I would often use food because I found that if I used food, then the students would find it much easier to imagine actually being somewhere, so it's sort of beginning to bring life into the discourse. And as I say, without giving you the long version of this, it became more and more painful almost for me, because I guess what I was realizing is that in order to study architecture the way I wanted to, I had to go outside architecture. And I was then invited to teach at the London School of Economics on the Cities programme. The first year, actually, they had that programme, and I was the studio director. And I got really excited because I thought, this is going to be it, and we have sociologists and politicians and economists and traffic engineers and housing experts all talking about the city. But I realized that year, actually still everyone is in their silo. So then it became really almost kind of like a pain in me that I was something I was trying to get at, but I couldn't quite get there. How we can really talk about a city and understand a city in a way that really is like what living in a city is, because I'm from London. I love London. I'm a city lover, But architecture, it just felt so dead in comparison to the real experience of being in a city. And it was actually with a colleague from the London School of Economics that I had the idea of writing about a city through the lens of food. It came to me suddenly. We were chatting. This is in April 2000. And I'll never forget the moment, because it was like the moment that changed my life. I actually have had one of those. And I remember the skin on my arms going, goose skin, and my hair standing up. Because I just thought, this is my thing. This is my thing. And that was it. And as I say, I'd been reading about food. I'd been interested in it. I mean, when I was in Rome, I'd actually studied the market area of the city, because I realized that, the market would be where everyday life would be going on. And it was everyday life that I was interested in. So food had been sort of at the back of my head for a long time, but it came, to the front. And I realized I can use food as a lens to look at the city. And that, as I say, is 22 years ago now. And the amazing thing is that, and obviously the book that you very kindly just showed me is the result of that thought having continued. And of course, now I don't just use food to look at the city. I use it to look at the world and at life. And it's just the most incredible lens, because it shapes everything we do. So, I haven't stopped being an architect in the way I think, but I've stopped kind of building buildings because to me, the thing that's really interesting about, architecture is that, deep down it poses the question of how can we live better?
Yeah.
That is the ultimate question of architecture. And obviously, if you're an architect, what you're trying to do is design cities and buildings and sort of just spaces that help people live better. So I'm just really asking the same question, but through the lens of food, because I think, the question of how can we eat better and how can we live better are just, they're like this. They're completely the same question. So food for me now is really just a very wonderful sort of counter tool to use alongside the design mind, the people who sit down with a pen and pencil and actually try to sketch out a possible future world. I think if they have food in their minds, then they will ask all the right questions about how people are actually going to live there. And it will not become just abstract and potentially dangerous, because it will have life in it. So that wasn't a very short answer, was it? But,
Yes.
That's anyway how I got there in the first place.
I have so many comments and questions appearing in my head right now, but let's keep it short than 10 hours because I don't know. I don't know if anyone would be ready to spend 10 hours listening to this podcast. I hope 10 hours in a row. But let me take it from this angle. So first, I'm really happy for you that you kind of managed to find your own interest within this world of architecture and cities, because I think that this is a big struggle for many young people who are also graduating. Some of them are also listening to this podcast. And then I'm just thinking about that. How did you get your interest in food and also especially in writing into food? Because as an architect, we have kind of so many talents that designing the actual building or a city, it's only one of them. But there is a part of architects, of urban designers who educate as you and also who write about architecture or our cities. And this is also something that you did, because like our main topic of this conversation, your book, Sitopia, is not your first book that you have written actually. No. Before there was also The Hungry City. So could you share something more about your inspiration behind writing and writing books about the food and its relation to our cities?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I'm one of those people, I mean, I always was at school, one of those people who was equally good at everything. And I'm not saying I'm brilliant, by the way. I'm just saying some people have a particular amazing skill. And I didn't really have that. I was just good at everything, you know, at a level down from brilliant. And, you know, and often, I mean, with architecture, again, I mean, I think there's such a thing as an architectural mind, you know, and I don't know whether you would relate to this, but, you know, we think spatially is what I would say, you know, and I had a fascinating conversation with a friend who's I do consider to be brilliant, you know, many years ago, who's not an architect, he's actually a musician. And I said, you know, we got on really well. And I said to him, oh, you know, people like us who think spatially, you know, and he kind of looked at me and said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, oh, you know, well, it's just everything's kind of just spatial and connected. And he said, no, I honestly, I don't know what you're on about. So I thought, oh, okay, that's really interesting. So I have a particular kind of mind that is not shared by everyone I find interesting. And I thought about that a lot since. And I think actually, you know, one of the reasons that I'm able to do what I do is that, I mean, if you think about the questions I'm asking questions like, what does it take to feed a city? Or, you know, how can we use the lens of food to ask what is a good life? I mean, these are enormous kind of philosophical questions. And really, I should be too scared to do this, you know, because I know I'm not qualified. But the thing is, because I think like an architect, and because to me, the question presents itself almost like a design problem. You know, it's not scary because I know that the question is real. You know, it's a bit like you're given a design project and somebody says, okay, you got a site this big and I need a kind of, you know, I need a stables and I need a restaurant and I need, you know, and you start wrestling with a problem that is real. And for me, that's what thinking is like. So it's very concrete to think. And that's why I say I haven't really stopped being an architect, even though I haven't drawn stuff for a long time. So the writing part, to me, if you can think, you can write. You know, honestly, it's that simple. And there's a lot of mystique around writing. And honestly, I genuinely, when I started writing, I thought, I can't write a book. You know, I mean, how do you write a book? But of course I can, because I can think. You know, and if you can think, I mean, literally, you know, you and I are having a conversation now. I mean, we could be recording. I mean, in fact, we are recording it, or you are. You could transcribe what we're saying, and that would be worth reading if we have an interesting conversation. So I don't think there's that much of a mystery. I mean, and I think it should be debunked in a sense that sort of writing and drawing or designing are completely different things. They're not. They're both ways of expressing thought and expressing intention. And to me, we should encourage people to move from one skill to another, because I think it actually, the more we do different things, different disciplines, you know, the better we become at what we're trying to do. And in the end, I mean, I'm quite old now, you know, I'm in my 60s. And, you know, when you get to my kind of age, you realize that actually just kind of having an idea and following it is what matters. And the more you do that, the more everything is the same. You know, the questions I'm asking are the same as, if you like, a sort of chef is asking when they're trying to cook a nice dinner. It's the same as a mother or father is asking when they're trying to bring up a child. It's the same as a urban designer is trying to ask when they're looking at a sort of transport interchange or a public space. We're all trying to say, how can I make life better by doing this well? And we have to give ourselves permission to ask that question and to realize that's what we're doing as well. Because, I mean, another very interesting moment happened to me when I was writing, I had the idea for the book Sitopia, which we should explain to probably your listeners means food place, from the Greek sitos for food, so sitos. And I made this word up about 15 years ago as a kind of alternative to utopia. So it's literally a way of understanding that the world is shaped by food, and therefore we can use food as a way of thinking about big questions. I gave myself permission to do that, and I remember thinking at the time, I can't make up a Greek word. That's for other people. Of course you can make up a word. Who says you can't? So I think we have to give ourselves permission to say, I have an idea and it is worthwhile. And, even though it seems bigger than me and I feel unqualified, I'm going to follow it anyway, because that's all I've done, and I've now been doing it, as I say, for 22 years. And after that amount of time, you find, actually quite a lot about a subject. So even though I don't like the term expert, and I never call myself an expert, because that, again, has a whole series of connotations I'm not very comfortable with. If you want to ask me about food and cities, I will talk to you, as you say, for 12 hours nonstop. So, you become the thing that you're trying to ask the question about. And you can do it in any medium, writing, drawing, whatever works best for you. It just turns out that, in a way, for me, a combination of writing and drawing, and actually, as it turns out, maybe more writing than drawing, is what helps me to ask the questions I'm asking. But you can do it in any medium.
Your story, your way of thinking is very inspiring. And again, I also have so many thoughts in my mind as well. And also, as you can see, the listeners will unfortunately not see us, but as we can see each other, you can probably say that...
Probably quite a good thing, actually.
You can probably see that I'm smiling a lot because it's so great for me to be able to talk to you and develop these ideas of the book, and also all the practical advice you share also regarding writing a book, because it's a thing that I would love to do one day, but it is also like a very maybe scary process in a way, because you need to go through so many things. But since you managed, and you've written this excellent book of Sitopia, which really, 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 really captivated me. And you've already mentioned what Sitopia is, but could we develop that thread? Could you say something more about how you and how we should understand Sitopia?
Yeah, of course. So, basically what I've realized through the writing of these two books that I've written now, as I said, the first one was asking the question of how do you feed a city? And the second one is asking the question of how can we use the lens of food to ask what is a good life? So they both came out of this original idea, this realization that food would be an interesting lens through which to sort of look at the world. And what I discovered when I was researching my first book, Hungry City, is that everything in the world is shaped by food. So, you don't necessarily think about it, but we are made of food. By the time you're about 25 years old, there are no atoms left in your body that you were born with. So you are literally made up of the meals you've eaten along the way, which slightly blew my mind when I realized that. But, you literally are what you eat. But we're now discovering that, what you eat really affects the way you think and your emotions and your microbiome and so on. So your mind is shaped by food. Your body is made by food. The cities we live in, this is what, I discovered when I was researching Hungry City, is that they're shaped by food. If you look at a city that was founded before the railways came along, it's literally shaped according to where the food is coming in. So the city would have been built where it could feed itself, so it would have been built in a sort of fertile area. And then so you would have had sort of grain being grown and maybe coming in by river because grain is heavy, and animals would walk in because they can provide their own transport. The city would have been surrounded by, market gardens and vineyards and so on. So, it's literally the city is shaped physically by food. And if you look at any city, older than, say, sort of 150, 200 years, you will see, streets called Fish Street, Bread Street, Cow Street, because it was full of food. So that was a big revelation. But of course, the landscape is also shaped by food because we farm to feed the city. So, the landscapes we're used to, even the ones we sort of think of as quite natural, a lot of them are modified, have been modified through many, many centuries to produce food for us. So, so cities are shaped by food, landscapes. Of course, we're now discovering climate is shaped by food. About a third of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with food and farming. Politics are shaped by food. Again, historically, it's much clearer. But, one of my favorite examples is the fact that, Paris had a revolution and London didn't, is because Paris could not easily feed itself and London could because of geography, because London is on a navigable river, which is the Thames, whereas Paris is on a non-navigable river, which is the Seine. And therefore the French king, had to be responsible for feeding people. And then when the food ran out, he got blamed. So, it's just so politics, economics, obviously, because guess what? What is the most important thing in our lives? Food. Historically, again, food was actually the most expensive thing that most people bought every day. So, even 50 years ago, it was responsible probably for, say, 50% on average of people's outgoings. Now, of course, it's housing that we spend most of the money on, but that's been a sort of conscious decision, and that's been as the result of industrialization, creating this, apparent thing of cheap food, which, by the way, doesn't exist. And that's really my big argument in Sitopia. So, I realized, okay, food shapes our world in multiple ways. So we just kind of need a word for this. And actually, it was when I was researching Utopia. So at the end of Hungry City, Hungry City follows the journey of food through the city. So it goes from the land to the road, to the market, to the kitchen, to the table, to the waste dump. And then in the last chapter, I was thinking, how do I bring all this together? And I thought, well, I'll look at Utopia, because Utopia is our greatest tradition of thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live. And I read in the introduction to my copy of Thomas More's Utopia that Utopia can either mean a good place or no place. So the U in Utopia can either come from the Greek word good, EU, which is spelled EU, or the Greek word no, OU. So it's a good place but no place. In other words, it's ideal and therefore it can't exist. And I remember being really depressed by this and thinking, well, we desperately need a way of thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live. And the one tradition that we have actually aims at perfection and therefore can't exist. And then I had this idea, okay, I've discovered that we live in a world shaped by food. Maybe I can invent a word that means food place. And I just rang some friends up who happen to be, they're very, very distinguished scholars in ancient Greek. And I said, if you're ancient Greek and you wanted a word that meant food place, what would it be? And they said, well, the Greek word for food is sitos, and topos means place. So logically it'd be Sitotopia, but that just sounds like you've got a stutter. So, just get rid of one of the TOs and you got Sitopia. So that's how I came to invent the word. And that was the title of the last chapter of Hungry City. And then when the book came out, which is, 2008 now, so, incredibly 14 years ago already, I started having lots of conversations with people like you and lovely people like you. And, my thinking carried on. And I thought, now that I've named this phenomenon that we live in a world shaped by food, what do we do about it? What can we do with it? And that's how I came to write the book, Sitopia, that you have there.
How does it play all together? Because I would like to just briefly discuss, we already mentioned that about how food shapes our cities. And you just said that it's inevitable because food shape the cities and the way how they look like. But I think that there are also many different aspects that shape our cities. It might be the terrain, the geography. It might be, unfortunately, wars. So do you think that the food is kind of this umbrella, which is kind of the main factor which influence our cities, or it is more of an interplay between many different factors?
Yeah, food is the great connector. So, of course, food's not the only thing in the world. But, you mentioned war, for example. Of course, what we're seeing now is, the appalling, Russian invasion of Ukraine. Food is becoming a massive part of it. In fact, literally on the news this morning, I was hearing people saying how Putin is using food as a sort of weapon. He's weaponizing grain. And of course, what war shows you is, war is often over territory, and territory is often about resources like food. So, and who knows what mad Putin has in his head, but, and obviously ideas of rebuilding a great Russian empire, whatever it is. But, deep down, the reason he's interested in Ukraine is because it's such a rich country in terms of natural resources like, grain, its grain fields, and of course, minerals as well. But, it's a big part of it. And so I'm not saying food's kind of the only thing in town, but I am saying that without it, there is nothing else, because we literally can't live without it. And so it doesn't matter what scenario you look at, whether it's peacetime or wartime, and whether it's a sort of democracy or a tyranny or whatever it is, food is always a really interesting way in to understanding what's going on. And I mean, often when I look at not just the Ukrainian war, but wars in the past, I sort of think, okay, how were people eating? And actually very, very famously, Napoleon, ironically, he was one of the first people to adopt canned food for his army because he totally understood that an army marches on its stomach. Then, of course, famously, he sort of made this crazy kind of attempt to invade Russia. I mean, it's amazing how these men, mostly men it has to be said, kind of make these, have these weird delusions of grandeur, and they just forget about, reality in a sense. And of course, famously, he totally underestimated the scale of the project. And then a lot of his army just starved on the way back because they ran out of supplies. So, I think, as I say, because food is it's not only a lens, but also in a way a mirror. It sort of shows us how far we're drifting away from a good life, in a sense. If you live in a society that doesn't value food, which unfortunately is the case in the UK, I would say less so in Poland, by the way. I mean, because, often, the degree to which we've moved away from a traditional food culture is also the degree to which we don't value food, because what industrialization does is it creates this illusion of cheap food. And in order to eat a thing called cheap food, you have to have forgotten what real food is, and I know I have some Polish friends, and I know, they're very, very passionate about mushrooms, for example. And, they really value the food from the forest and therefore the forest itself, and for example, you still have amazing forests in Poland and, which I know are full of wild boar, and the size of a forest used to be counted on the basis of how many pigs it could sustain, not how big it was, which, so in other words, it's a direct measure of how nourishing this forest was, and all these sorts of things. So, I mean, in terms of the city today, I think what's tragic about cities in the West is that, and again, I've been to Poland. I was in Krakow, if I'm saying that correctly, a few years ago, and you have amazing markets there still, with wonderful produce and so on. So, I would just say, really hang on to that, because that is a really important link that I think once you lose it, as we've lost it in the UK, it's very, very difficult to get back. So in the UK, because we industrialized earlier than anywhere else on earth, we destroyed our peasantry, if you like, moved people out off the land and into cities, and then you make people dependent on industrial food. That's literally what happened in the UK. So we've forgotten our skills. Nobody in the UK goes foraging. I mean, we have a tiny handful of professional foragers because we've rediscovered foraging, but it's not a normal thing to do. Normal people don't do it, whereas I know, again, half my family is Finnish and they all forage, so it's just something they haven't lost, is that ability. So, to what extent does it shape our lives now or shape our cities now? It shapes it, I think, in terms of a presence or absence of an understanding of how fundamental this connection is between us and the land, us and seasons, us and the region, and actually the sort of celebratory nature of food, which still really means something. And I think this is I talk about it in Sitopia, as you know, but I think the appreciation of things that are natural and come for free, like sort of mushrooms in the forest, shall we say, is really central to our ability to sort of get pleasure out of things that aren't going to destroy the planet. So to me, it's really key to our ability to build sort of good lives that are fit for the 21st century, shall I say.
Yes.
So I think even if it's not directly visible, if it's not literally a cow walking down the road so you can see the physical relationship, it's still there. And I mean, because I see through a food lens, if I go to as I say, a city like Krakow and I go to the market there, I go immediately, okay, they still got this, which is really good. You might find it harder to see yourself because you do still have it. And often the things that are so normal and everyday to us are the things we find hardest to see. So in a way, I would almost say it's part of my duty to point out to you how important and precious that is.
I need to say that I'm particularly interested in our relation to food. And you've already mentioned that a bit, because I think that we are living in this I don't know how to call them, but let's use the word crazy times.
Yeah, good word.
Where we also experience and learn, because pandemic showed us that we started to think, okay, maybe we should buy more food because we were facing the lockdowns. And now the war shows us the shortages of food, of grains that both Ukraine and Russia are big producers of. And here you also mentioned about the industrialization of food. And this is the term I really like. And also you developed this thought in Sitopia. And it was eye-opening to me because I think that you had a very good point with saying that we are so used to everything if it comes to food that it just ends up on our plate within a blink of an eye. And we hardly ever think of the route that this food had to go through to end up on our plate, because we are so used to just going to the closest store, supermarket, and buying the packed food or something else. But it is almost an instant process. So do you think that we really kind of forgot our relation to food?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, more so in the UK than in Poland, I would say. But yeah, we definitely have. And, you know, I often say, I mean, in fact, the idea for Sitopia came when I was doing a drawing, which maybe we can post on your website because we can't show people on the podcast. But I mean, it's kind of like a bowl of soup that is sitting in front of you, has the universe in it. And then if you radiate out from the soup to the table where you're sitting, the people you're eating with, to the environment you're in, the cook who cooked that soup, to the market where the cook bought the ingredients, to the city that the market sits in, to the landscape that the city sits in, to the natural world that the landscape sits in, and then out to the universe. That is a sort of, you know, that is a complete, I mean, I'll show you now, and we can maybe post it later, but I mean, that's the drawing I did sorry, I'll take it out of its plastic, but, you know, that Sitopia came from is sort of how, you know, you sort of really radiate back from this bowl of soup in sort of expanding circles.
That's amazing.
Out to the universe.
Let's publish that as well after the conversation.
All right. Well, I'll send you.
I love it.
Thank you. And to me, it sort of becomes very philosophical at this point, because I think if we don't value food and we don't think about, as you say, the landscapes it comes from, or the people who made it, or the plants, or the animals that we're actually eating, because we, of course, kill living things in order to eat. That's a very important thing to say, which is why, of course, food can't be cheap, because food is life. You know, if we don't value that, we're devaluing life. And if once you lose the value of life, it's kind of game over for civilization. So I think food is the most obvious way of getting back our true value system. And as I say, you know, just looking at your bowl of soup or porridge in the morning or something and kind of thinking, okay, well, where did, you know, those barley flakes come from or whatever? And, you know, was it grown in a way that's going to sustain the landscape where it came from and sustain biodiversity, or not? And were the farmers who made it paid enough to live good lives or not? And where did the profit go? Did it go to the people who did the hard work, or does it go to some corporation who's sucking up 30% of the profit, et cetera, et cetera? You know, did it come into the city and did it animate public space? Did it go to a lovely market where people are kind of going and actually meeting other humans, or did it just come through some sort of invisible, you know, system and sort of end up being delivered by some slave in a kind of peppermint? Sorry, we have a lot of Deliveroo in the UK. You know, people on bicycles paid very, very low wages to sort of deliver food in the middle of the night and all of this sort of thing. You know, and also, where is you know, is it valued enough that we're going to eat it all, or are we going to waste it, which is just a complete and utter waste of everything that went before? So, you know, I think it's that bowl of soup or porridge is a really good way of understanding how profoundly connected we are to the natural world, because literally we are part of the natural world and we are made of it. And that meal that you're eating is like an emissary from a landscape. And so it's a really good way of sort of mentally connecting and then saying, okay, I have power because I eat. And in my choices of how to eat, I can shape the world better or worse. Now, I do realize that not everyone is in a position to spend lots and lots of money on very, very special organic food and so on. But actually, my argument is that we have to stop farming in a destructive way. So industrial farming, you know, livestock production is incredibly destructive. It's very wasteful because, you know, if you feed animals on grain that you could be eating directly, you're feeding far fewer people. So we have to incorporate animals into a regenerative farming system, for example. That's going to cost more. And of course, it's much nicer for the animals. So we need to stop undervaluing the good food that is produced by a very small number of producers and saying that it's okay to actually, bottom trawl oceans so that you're destroying marine, ecosystems, or treat animals as though they're kind of, units of, just unfeeling units of production rather than sentient beings. And therefore, we have to structure society around, the true value of food, which also means basically, I'm arguing for tax reform, wealth redistribution, because my vision is a society in which everyone can afford to eat well. Now, of course, ironically, historically, if you like, in nations where, the vast majority of people were still farmers, arguably most people did actually eat pretty well, oddly. Other stuff probably wasn't great, but now we have technology, so you don't have to be cut off if you're a farmer or in the countryside. As we discovered under lockdown, you can live in the countryside and still be complete. Like we're doing now, we're talking on Zoom, you don't have to be in the same space. So I think this could be a moment for, rural renewal, because people, and it's happening in the UK, by the way, more people are wanting to live in the countryside. Basically, the model that we had, which is obviously what I call the late capitalism model, so the late capitalism model is the model where basically rich people have bought up everything. And it's the sort of the phase called rentier capitalism, where you can earn more money. This is what Thomas Piketty's famous book about capitalism is all about. When you can earn more by already being rich than you can by working, then capitalism doesn't work anymore. And that's the phase we've reached, unfortunately. So we need a radical program of wealth redistribution and land reform. And we need to make it possible for people who want to farm. That's my view, because I think we need more farmers and not fewer farmers, because we need to move from this highly mechanized, industrialized version of farming, which, again, I could go on endlessly about why it's so destructive, but, it's the use of chemicals on land basically kills off all the insect and bird life, and therefore you've got sort of ecosystem collapse. So we need biodiversity, we need to farm with living soils, we need to farm in a much more local and regional way, and this means we need more farmers. But we can do it. It's just realizing that this is a thing that we should be doing.
I also like how in your book you say that there is no such a thing as cheap food, because we produce so much and we globalize. And also you've mentioned about the farmers who back in the days were producing a lot of food, and they were eating healthy and good themselves. And it reminds me of a book I've read recently, and it was also one of the most eye-opening books for me. It was a book called The Hunger by Martin Caperos. And he was also saying especially about the hunger in, for example, Africa, that the farmers used to feed themselves, but in the midst of the globalization, they started to export most of the harvest. And unfortunately, they started to face hunger and famine themselves. So it is a very complicated relation that we have. And surprisingly, or maybe not, but we made this kind of long development path from, as we mentioned, from armies marching and having food with them, for food being the kind of thing that shaped our cities. And food played a key role in the development. But unfortunately, I think that sometimes we not only don't know where our food is coming from, but also we stop respecting that, especially in the Western societies.
Completely, yeah.
One of the episodes I recorded some time ago, it was about the food waste in the supermarkets. And there are some crazy numbers of how much food do we waste. So my question is, and of course, I assume it might be a very broad and very big question, but how can we reconnect with the food and its production? How can we better understand that food is the key element, and how to give the respect that it should have nowadays?
By the way, I haven't heard of that book, but it sounds really interesting. So thank you for that recommendation. And just to go back to what you just spoke about there, I think it's really interesting that, we have a historical idea that, being a farmer is a bad way of life. And because farmers are stupid and they're in the countryside and what do they know and everything, which is a historical urban prejudice, basically. And the idea was that, progress was moving everyone off the land and into a city so they can have a nice job in an office and blah, blah, blah. And we're now realizing that's rubbish on every possible level. And actually, the irony, as I said, under lockdown in the UK, I mean, for the first time in history, more people want to move out of London and live in the countryside than want to come and live in London. So, I think we're seeing that this it's a very old prejudice that life in the city is better than life in the countryside. And as I say, I think the internet is a game changer, because now that you can live in the countryside and be connected, this is nothing not to like, really. So go back to your question. I mean, how can we reconnect with food? Well, I mean, I think it is obviously sort of a cultural shift that we need. I think, interestingly, I mean, in the last 20 years that I've been writing and thinking about food, public awareness of the importance of food has completely shifted. So in countries like America and the UK, I think, we've known for a long time there was a problem with the food system. So, for example, when I wrote my book, Hungry City, which came out in 2008, that was actually the same year as the banking crisis. And actually, I mean, not many people know this, but the banking crisis created food riots in something like 42 countries globally. Why? Because of exactly what you just mentioned, because the people used to farm, so they used to feed themselves. And okay, life was a bit simple, but actually they were just basically, they were self-sufficient, and they had, what we call food sovereignty. Once you say, oh no, you're not going to feed yourself anymore, you're going to grow green beans and we're going to export them to the UK, you turn them from being producers into being consumers. And then and of course they're paid very low wages. They might seem high to them, but actually they are exploited. They're paid virtual slave wages. And then, of course, they are then dependent on the global commodity market for their food. And as we've seen with the war in Ukraine, the global commodity market is extremely volatile. And that we're going to have huge, I mean, we're going to see it again, unfortunately, because, as you know, Ukraine and Russia between them sort of produce something like 20% of globally exported wheat. And some countries rely, up to 90% of their imports of grain are from Ukraine, for example. So it's going to be very, very bad. But I mean, the reason why it's bad is we've allowed this system to develop where people stop being farmers and then they become dependent on globally traded grain, which, by the way, is controlled by maybe 3 or 4 companies. And, by the way, is also subject to speculation. So something like 80% of the trades that are done in the global food commodities market are done by people who have no intention of buying the actual food. They're just speculating. So this increases the volatility. And this was a big effect. This is a big reason why there was so much volatility in 2008. So just to say all of that. Right. So in terms of how do we make the reconnection, going back to your actual question, I think it has to happen at all levels. I mean, I'm arguing, as I say, for a revaluing of food. I think we have to stop externalizing the costs of food, because they're unaffordable, by the way. They're actually, I mean, industrial farming is now the most destructive human activity on the planet. And it's everything from climate change to pollution to loss of biodiversity to diet-related disease to water depletion and deforestation and all of these things. So if we basically internalize the true cost of food, this will create a level playing field. And suddenly you find, I mean, and of course it's not an easy thing to do, but even if we start by saying, okay, farmers who pollute rivers and lakes by, allowing all that excess fertilizer runoff to sort of go into the lake, which actually kills the lake, because what happens when the nitrogen from the fertilizer goes into the lake, it creates an algae bloom that then sort of cuts off all the oxygen from all of the fish underneath. If we charge those farmers for that, then they're going to have to stop polluting, but their costs are going to go up because they're going to have to farm much more carefully. And I think we need to go, in any case, as far as we can towards organic production. And there's so much to say about all of this, but it's quite complicated. But in a nutshell, when you farm with chemicals, it kills the soil. And we're now discovering, I mean, even only in the last decade, we're discovering, because of new developments in microscopy, by the way, that allows us to understand the human microbiome for the first time, that actually our health depends on complexity. And you can only produce complexity by farming with complexity, and that means with a living soil. So anyway, blah, 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 blah. That's a whole other kind of rabbit hole to go down. But, in essence, how do we make the reconnection? I mean, I think, in a way, we saw some of the answer to that under lockdown. I mean, lockdown was horrible for many people. But one thing that did happen is that lots of people working from home, had much more time than they've had in a long time because they weren't spending 4 hours, on a hot, sweaty tube going into the city and back and forth. So they actually, and of course, supermarkets did start running out of food because we have a very fragile food system. So people started to make their own stuff. They started growing their own food, making their own bread and all the rest of it. I know it's kind of a middle class thing in a way, but I mean, a lot of people who did that, just had an epiphany. It's just like,
yes.
If you've got time, and you've got all day to do it, it's actually really lovely to make your own bread and, to actually cook properly from scratch and sit down with your kids and have a conversation. And so I think, creating conditions in which people have that is entirely within our, it's within our sort of, we can do it. It's within our capability. We've just decided that that's not what a good life is. We've decided, or we haven't decided, we've gone along with this weird capitalist model that says a good life is, getting up at 6 a.m. and going into the city on a hot, sweaty train and working madly at a computer all day and earning money and coming home and being too exhausted to see your kids and going to bed and repeat so you can get rich. What the hell is that? It's just rubbish. So I think we just need a completely different vision of a good life, which is that you stay at home and you work from home and then maybe you go to work, but, not in a horrible rush, just kind of when you need to and want to. Yeah. Or we have more local, sort of offices locally, sort of in sort of hubs in the countryside. But we give people time back. And we say, okay, in exchange for money, which is this thing that you've been running after, you have time and you have somewhere beautiful to live. Yes. And you get your pleasure not out of buying new handbags, sort of every 3 months and going on exotic holidays, but actually having the pleasure of growing stuff, making stuff, sharing time with your friends and family, and feeling there's some meaning in what you do because you look after people, you care for them, you make beautiful things, and it's just a different vision. Nobody says we can't do this. I mean, I'm a complete fan of David Graeber's, who unfortunately died last year, but he's a brilliant, brilliant thinker, I think. And he very, very famously said, we make society and so we can unmake it and remake it. And I think we forget this. Yes. Other good lives are possible. We just have to decide it's what we want. So, I mean, I think food is just a sort of, once people really understand the pleasure of food and they start doing something like making their own bread, growing their own vegetables, whatever it is, even just going to a farmer's market or even just kind of taking time for food, often a sort of something goes on in their heads and they sort of think, actually, this is what I really want to do. And of course, it's not, again, just food. Food is just the sort of lowest hanging fruit, as we say, of a whole way of life that's about, just living in time, doing something meaningful, not dashing around like a mad scalded cat and just sort of taking pleasure in primary, simple things. And we could just redesign the world around that kind of life and those kinds of pleasures. It's very, very doable. But it takes a political visionary, I guess, to sort of see that. But I think it's a transition we need to make.
I'm an optimist myself, and I started worrying when you mentioned about all those things and how life looks like nowadays and what are the things that we are chasing and that maybe we forgot what it's really important in life. And as you mentioned, baking your own bread or growing veggies or even making your own kombucha. These are the things that bring us closer to the food. And I think that they make us more nutrition conscious. And do you think that we are on our way to being more food aware and nutrition conscious? Or there are some steps, some important steps that we should take as citizens to kind of get us there? Yeah,
no, I mean, definitely we're becoming more food conscious. I mean, I was going to say earlier, I mean, I think it's very important that, people like, Greta Thunberg and her kind of Fridays for Future movement and everything, realization that we can't go on as we are has exploded in the last 10 years or so. And that's really important because it means, more and more people are accepting that, what we were doing before can't carry on. And so they're looking for alternatives. And of course, as I said earlier, all of these new discoveries about digestion and nutrition and the way we actually, the way our microbiomes are so important to our health is really making us more conscious that we need to eat proper food and not just kind of highly processed, fast food rubbish that, of course, the McDonald's of this world would love us to sort of become addicted to. So I think it's completely shifting. What needs to shift is, if you like, politicians' willingness to take food seriously, because I write about this in the book as well, but I think because of, as I mentioned, historically politicians hated having to be responsible for feeding people, because it often ended badly. The politicians have been very happy to leave the feeding of their people to the food industry. And if you look at it now, that's verging on criminal, because the food industry does not have people's health in mind. It has profit in mind, and it doesn't have the health of farmers in mind, or the kind of the sustainability of landscapes in mind. It only has profit in mind. And therefore, we as a society have to say that the way we eat and what we eat is a common problem that we have to solve together. And that means our politicians have to take it seriously. And if they don't, we have to demand that they do. And I think, there's a pincer movement going on at the moment, in a way, between, the food movement, which is very strong. So you already have, global movements like, slow food, and like La Via Campesina, which is the global peasant movement, arguing for a totally different food system. But we still have governments like my own government who just don't get food at all. And they just want it to carry on being cheap. And my own government, who, of course, idiotically took us out of Europe, which is something for which I will never forgive them, by the way. And I won't rest until we've rejoined. But there we go. That's just my problem and half the country's problem. But, they just don't get food at all. And they're basically destroying our, farmers. They don't really care whether we have farmers in this country or not. They just want cheap food to be imported from somewhere. Now, I think the war in Ukraine might actually, if they have any brain cells in their heads, which is debatable, they might look at what's going on globally and think, this idea that I can always just get food from wherever is a fantasy. We need to start growing more food locally and regionally and sustainably everywhere, not just in the UK, not just in the countries in Africa we were talking about, but everywhere. That doesn't mean we stop trading. It just means that the basics of what we need are grown, with local plants that want to grow where they, plants flourish where they are indigenous. But so they do well. So, we're going to live on different foods in different parts of the world, and that's really good too. It's crazy that the world eats nothing but grain, or nothing but wheat. We should be eating more beans, more legumes. There's other varieties of grain like sorghum and millet and so on that have traditionally been staple foods in other parts of the world. So we need to diversify, but we also need to understand that, and this is something I'd love to get politicians to understand that food is about pleasure. It's actually about enjoyment. It's actually about bringing people together. And stop. I hate this phrase, how are we going to feed the world? And it speaks about everything that's wrong. Who's we? Who's the world? Does it want us to feed them? Isn't feeding what you do to animals, actually? Wouldn't it be better to say, how are we as a species going to eat in a way that means that we can coexist happily and sustainably in balance with the non-human, our fellow non-humans on the planet, which means with nature? So, how can we use food as a medium to sort of ask how we can rebalance our lives with the planet and also live well? And it's a totally different question with a totally different set of answers.
This, and there are also many other questions that I would love to ask. But then, as we mentioned already in our conversation, that would be a podcast on its own. It would have like 2 seasons of 20 episodes each. But for now, I would like to conclude, and I would like to ask you the final question, which would be book recommendation. And is there any interesting read that you would like to share with the listeners, besides, of course, your own books?
My own. Luckily, this is very easy for me because I already mentioned him, David Graeber. So David Graeber and David Wengrow. So David Graeber was an anthropologist and David Wengrow is an archaeologist. And they wrote a book that came out last year called The Dawn of Everything. And it's about how we evolved as humans. And it's about how the story is much more complicated than you think. And lots of the myths and stories that we tell ourselves are actually, they're just, they're a tiny part of a much bigger picture. And it's completely brilliant and completely fascinating. And it's totally changed the way I see lots and lots of things. And it's really fed into my own work in a very interesting way. So I would really wholeheartedly recommend that book, The Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wengrow.
Thank you. And I, of course, would like to use this opportunity to also recommend your books, especially Sitopia, because I need to admit that I'm so happy that we are able to discuss, because it was one of my really podcast dreams to be able to talk to you, because your book really shaped the way I see food. And especially that I had this huge surprise while I started reading it, because it was released in this kind of Happy City series of the books in Polish. And I was like, food, what does the food do in the books about the cities and happy cities? So I was a bit suspicious at the beginning. And then with every page, I was really mind blown about how important the food is in my life, in my friends' life, in my family's life, and also all the people living in the cities, but not only in the cities. So, Carolyn, I would like just to thank you so much for being part of Urbcast.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Marcin.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast. And I need to say that this one was a very special one, because as I mentioned in the introduction to this episode, Carolyn is, and especially her book, is something that influenced me a lot and changed the way I'm looking at the food, not only on my plate, but also in the cities. And if you would like to get to know more about Carolyn, about the book, and also about the book recommendation by Carolyn, please see the episode's description, and in the notes you can find all the links to the books and other interesting materials. I would like to say big thank you for listening to this episode and for supporting this podcast. And if you think that this episode would be interesting for anyone else, of your friends, family, or anyone that might find it interesting, please share it and let's grow this podcast together. For now, I need to say that I'm very excited, because the next episode will be exactly the number 100. So we will have a special anniversary, and I can't wait for that. Talk to you soon.